Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the World of Momos podcast. And on this episode, we have Joseph Robertson with us, and we will be talking about basically politics. I've been talking about politics a lot, so we'll be talking about what's going on, the leadership result of the Tory party as well, and how if it was a good thing or a bad thing, where we're headed, and how do we get out of the mess that we are in. But before we start that, we'll ask Joseph to tell us a bit about himself and also tell us a bit about Touchpoint Strategy as well. Hi there, Joseph.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me, Momus. I'm the director of Touchpoint Strategy, co-founder with my colleague, and we do a wide range of digital communication strategy, events, and also political strategy, predominantly with people within, I would say, the free speech camp. So across the spectrum of people who still believe in free speech, but we work with all kinds of clients, commercial and political. Um, and yeah, my background, I guess, I was a journalist before, and before that, I was running a think tank for a few years. So I've been in and around the political bubble for about 6 years, and my journey really into politics came because of Brexit, as I think it did for a lot of people. I was quite happily working normal jobs for the early part of my 20s, and then I sort of stumbled into politics by beginning to voice my views on Brexit and also to write about different policy areas. I've got an interest in education and foreign policy, um, and that ended up leading me down a rabbit hole, which made me realise that things were not as they seem. That there was a struggle going on a deeper level between what I would call really Marxist tendencies and sort of this creeping globalist tendency to do away with nationalism and with joy in one's homeland, and to do with destroying the family unit, to do with taking away our fundamental freedoms as a society, and also to destroy our history. And this concerned me, and I decided to give up more of my time in politics and research, and it's led me to where I am today.
So, would it be fair to say that when the Brexit thing came along, that you are a Brexiter and not a Remainer?
I was pretty strong Brexiteer, and I still am.
Mm,
I'm a strong believer in national sovereignty. I think the way that Brexit happened, the way it was managed, was awful. In some ways, a catastrophe for the country. We didn't make the most of our opportunities, and in fact, some could say that we've had seen detrimental effects from what happened after the vote and after we were actually taken out of the EU. There have been many positive effects, and there's certainly financially been many benefits in terms of our ability to make and pass our own laws in particular. But unfortunately, we have a very incompetent political class that was perhaps at times on
mm.
purpose not able to take advantage of that. So that's my position on it.
I
But
mean, I think so. It's pretty deliberate, isn't it? It seems pretty deliberate even now that we are not taking advantage of it.
hmm,
Because they sort of wanted to fail anyways, so that they can prove their point. See, it wasn't
right.
a good idea to get away, like, to get out of EU. It's just you, like, the peasant class who wanted to get out. You didn't understand how it works. So
Well, yeah.
it seems deliberate that that's what they try to do.
Exactly. I mean, I would say it's not just deliberate, but also symptomatic of a lot of the problems in our political class in the last 20 years is the lack of willingness to act. So very often, I think this is because they don't want to be blamed for anything, and whether they agree or not with
Hmm.
Brexit. Of course, we know that most of them didn't agree with Brexit, but even so, they are always looking for a blame taker to get them out of a fix. And this happens, with successive prime ministers, particularly with Boris Johnson, where there was perhaps, the right rhetoric or the right determination to actually get us out of the EU, but a real lack of willingness to stick his neck
Hmm.
out. And I believe even some of his advisors were Remainers. So, there's this pervasive feeling that to stand out or to make mistakes is not something that can be done in British politics anymore. And our great leaders in the past all made mistakes. Um, And I think that's one of the hallmarks of good leadership, not being afraid to be perceived as wrong. Um, and so we have this spineless, I would call them, class of politicians who are, I mean, we look at Trump for all his flaws. I mean, he's very loved for the simple reason that he makes decisions.
I think so. I personally think like the politics, it comes out of your society and your current society and stuff like that. I think so. What COVID showed me as well was people's tendency towards safetyism was alarming. I mean, it was way too much than I even imagined it to be. Right. So we made this. It seems like over the years, because how the welfare system, the encroaching welfare system has already sort of like subdued people, their ambitions taking it away, replace it with safetyism and stuff like that. There's a general feeling within the society as well where they would relate intellectualism with safetyism, right? So they would say, oh yeah, it can't be done like that, oh it shouldn't be done like that. We shouldn't do away with this and that, and they would sort of make red tape policies into like as if it was an intellectual thing to do. They don't want to go straight forward because they make it into that sort of a thing, right? And when you get a society which has been so maligned with these sort of feelings and ideas and made it into an intellectual thing, you're going to get politicians who are of going to be of the same mold, right? And the reason why Trump is there in America is because Americans on a whole, especially the conservative side, and most of the liberal side as well, they are a bit more braver, they are risk takers because they don't have that welfare system. They develop that sort of mentality from an early age, unless they are sheltered in metropolitan cities and stuff. Even there, like of all New Yorkers are supposed to be pretty tough because they don't have any safety, they have to protect themselves. So I mean, I know we complain about politicians, but this is why I say like politician class will never get better unless we improve the society, the mindset of the society as a whole.
Hmm. Yeah, I think we've moved away from a moral framework to a health and safety framework. That's the way I'd put it. I mean,
Hmm.
it's an interesting paradigm where you've got people sort of trying to look at what the safest option is, but not really considering whether or not it's the right option. And of course,
Yeah.
that age old phrase is, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And I think a lot of that is to do with
Hmm.
the moral checks and balance rather than the economic framework, let's say, or the reason to do it for purely pecuniary or financial means. And of course, we've seen this creeping class of people, particularly since I'd say the 50s and 60s, who have based all of their merit, all of their prosperity, all of their philosophical interest on how well a country is doing economically, financially, rather than spiritually or morally. And so we have this real
Yeah.
clash between how people want to lead, how people want to live, how people want to lead their lives, perhaps on issues such as family or the right to life, and all of these important issues that aren't discussed anymore, particularly in British culture. They're perhaps discussed a little bit more still in American culture, but they get swept under the carpet for the sake of issues like economy, inflation, the welfare state, and all these buzzwords which sound important, and they are important, but they don't really have any paradigm or moral framework to operate in. So it turns into this kind of liberal buzzword salad. I mean, saw very recently the deputy leader of the Reform Party talking about how he's going to be supporting the upcoming suicide bill in this country. And I mean, I just thought, I mean,
Hmm.
for a reactionary, libertarian, family oriented party, that's a very odd stance to take, and it shows a real lack of political philosophical awareness to policymakers in this country, not just in the two major parties, but even in some of the more reactionary or I would say, well, the parties that want to change and reform the system underneath them. I mean, the Lib Dems are devoid of ideas, as we'd expect, because that's in their their heritage. But to see somebody from the Reform Party saying that kind of speaks to a wider gaping hole in our political soul in this country. And you certainly would have conversations on a far more in-depth scale in the US about something as divisive and sensitive as this. It wouldn't just be swept under the carpet with niceties on the latest chat show. And I think that's one of our problems, is that we are very,
Yeah,
very
I mean, for
comfortable.
convenience, isn't it? Go on. You were saying something.
No, I was just saying that we fall into this trap of being too comfortable, I think, in this country, and it's costing us a
Mm.
lot of our bravery. It's costing us a lot of our moral conversation, and ultimately, unless you have a proper moral framework and a proper statutory framework for everything, you can't really speak about conservatism. You can't really speak about family values. You can't really speak about any of the things that matter, because they don't have a basis to spring from or to flourish from. It's almost like
Mm.
planting, a tree and then never watering it in the soil and hoping that it's going to grow, or putting it in a very shadowy pocket of your garden and expecting it to flourish. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So until the groundwork is laid properly, I don't think we can have that conversation.
Yeah, and this is what I think as well. Like what I was trying to say before as well. That groundwork, I think, so needs to start on societal level first before it reaches because out of that societal society is where the politics is going to come from. The political leaders are going to come from there, right? So and we can see the decline in people going to the church, or having, being attached to their traditions and their families and stuff like that, is completely correlated to this materialism sneaking into the politics, where we are more concerned about, like, people are becoming economical, just metrics to them, it's like how well our economy is doing, or how well it's not doing. Oh, it's not doing that well, so we'll get more of these units from outside, doesn't matter which culture, wherever they're from, to fill in so that our economy can do better, right? So uh, what what good is the economy of a country if the whole sense of the nation is destroyed, the whole identity of the nation is destroyed? And and like you said, like I talk about as well, like every nation, every region has a soul of its own, right? What's the point of inhabiting a body when there is no soul in it? It's just like, okay, we are creating robots, then our nations will become robots then, right? And England is just going to become a international migrant center. So what's the point then of having England? Then just call it that international migrant center, block A, or whatever. you know
Well, I believe that this issue is not just exclusive to the reactionary framework from, let's say, the left, or from the open borders people, or from the ultra liberals. It's also creeping into the right wing. And I remember an article I wrote,
Mm.
it was a good number of months ago now, maybe over 6 months ago, but I talked about how intersectionality is now the problem of the right wing. And by that, I meant that we are forced to take very unlikely bedfellows to restore our own balance of power in the conversation. So if you think about what Elon Musk's politics or philosophy is, I mean, as an example, he's a brilliant man, he's a great creator, a wonderful entrepreneur, but he is not a conservative, nor would he claim to be, and he doesn't
Mm.
have particularly conservative instincts. But of course, we have to latch on to a character like Mr. Musk to really further our cause, without really considering the ramifications of what that means to us philosophically. And a similar thing happened, of course, with Andrew Tate. I mean, you've got this guy who is an abuser,
Mm.
a pimp, a cartel man, a trafficker, all of these things which are completely diametrically opposed to what we believe in as conservatives. But because he said the right things about gender dynamics and the framework in which we live and sexuality, he was taken to be this kind of right wing cult hero for 10 minutes. And it's a very sad indictment on where we are as a political cause, that we have to take on these heroes, or these um, faux heroes who don't actually respect or value what we are talking about, perhaps as conservatives, but will give us the limelight for a little bit longer. And I think one of our biggest battles really is
And this is
in media.
do, and this is exactly like it leads to what I want to talk about as well. This is exactly the point that I saw within the Tory leadership, which is why I was against Kemi Badenoch as well. So
Mm.
just because she was saying the right things in certain areas, we said, oh, it will latch on to her, and this idea of how you need an ethnic minority to fight wokeism, right? As if like English people are so weak and so bereft of any intelligence that they need an outsider to fight their battles. Like, what does that tell you anyways? What does that signal, right? What does that signal to a non-Western country outside the sphere, who don't understand liberalism, who don't even have liberalism, right? So they don't understand the equality of like the seeking of equality in this way, right? There is no way in hell that if you were in Pakistan and a white guy said like I was born in Pakistan, so I'll become the president of Pakistan, right? And I'll become like I want to be the president of Pakistan, and everyone made him the president of Pakistan because he was white and he could like talk about whatever their anti-wokeism or whatever that would be. There's no way in hell they would accept that, because they would not accept him as their own.
Yeah.
It's hard to do that, right? They
Mm.
would want their own person in the time of need. They would want someone of their own, right? Someone at least who have an investment, and it's not just about skin color, right? Because ethnicity is skin deep as well. So there's a lot of things, like in the same way, like Keir Starmer is not representative of the representative that people need, even though his skin color is the same, right? It's a wider sort of an issue. She doesn't connect in any of those ways for me. She doesn't she doesn't represent England, right? Maybe metropolitan elites at most, right? But somehow this idea came about that we need her to fight wokeism, right? Uh,
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if she's conservative or not, or because she isn't really a conservative, even though she says she is. Because if she was a actual conservative, she would understand the importance of people, the majority in a nation, the native population, being represented by one of their own. And she wouldn't even have put herself up for that position in the first place.
Yeah, it's a difficult and challenging topic because there are certain people who've lived here for many generations who do feel genuinely British. I was more irritated by the use of the word English in this conversation because there is no way you can say that Kemi
Yeah.
Badenoch is English. She is not. She's Nigerian by birth, and so with Kemi, it's a very different scenario because I mean she's not even a third or fourth or fifth generation immigrant to this country. She was born in Nigeria. She's proud of her Nigerian roots. She consistently talks about running as a Nigerian in British Parliament. And there is a place for that because obviously she has her own roots to this country that is legal, and she's added value to this country, and she deserves to be here by all accounts. But the point is that you cannot claim to be of this country just because you came here. You can, I think, after several generations, get to the point where you are genuinely British, right? Because that is your predominant identity.
Mm.
But if you are still wearing the flag of your own
Mm.
country in some way, if you're not English or British by blood, then it is a difficult position to say that you're purely representing the interests of the British people, because of course there's going to be a conflict of interest, whether it's cultural, whether it's in terms of foreign policy, whether it's actually ideological. And I think this is one of the things people don't talk about enough, right? Is that the real issue is not your skin color as much as the ideology that you represent on the basis of where you are from. So if you are from Nigeria, you'll have a
Mm.
very different view of economics than you would if you were British. You might have been through a British education system, but in some way your vision will be coloured by what you learned either as a child or from your immediate family. And so we don't have this breakdown of all the substrata of what it means to be British, what it means to be English. Um, and also the love of country is something that's deeply personal. It comes from a place of having grown within that country. There's a sort of pastoral element to this as well, which Roger Scruton spoke about so much, of oikophilia, the love of place, the love of belonging, the love of being from somewhere. And that cannot be instilled in someone just by virtue of coming to that place. They may love it very much. I mean, I love Rome as an example, and I have a have a small percentage of Italian in me, in even in my blood. But I couldn't go and spend a few years there and immediately become Italian again. I mean, it's impossible. I'm all British. I'm English. I'm Scottish. I have these roots deeply embedded inside of me, and so the way we wave that aside as though it's just sort of an annoyance, I think, to some people. They don't want to think about what it really means to be human at the end of the day. Perhaps it goes back to your point about how we're perceived as just economic indicators. There's this creeping feeling that we need to subdue what makes us human: our passions, our instincts, our philosophy, our way of life, our if you like, our identity, and actually become something that fits in, something that isn't too other, something that doesn't want to talk about what they really think or believe or act or love or feel, and just be put in a box. And the sum result of that is that everyone is the same and no one has any unique identifying characteristic, and therefore anybody can do a job. And of course, that's how we end up getting transgender athletes
Hmm.
in female sports. I mean, it's not a massive leap to get to that point. And so I think, someone like Kemi does two things. One, okay, she may be bad for the Conservative Party, but can things really get much worse? But actually, she's a really useful indicator of where our culture is at. And I
Mhm.
think that's quite useful.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. Uh, um, I mean, as far as I know, she was born in London. She was born in Wimbledon, I think so. But then she went and lived for 16 years in Nigeria, and then she came back. As far, but this is as far as I know. But there's a concept as well, like of identity, right? How you actually, um, how you care for a nation is when you mix your identity with your nation, right? Because unless you do that, it's very hard for you to care for that nation as if you would care for yourself, right? So
Mm,
when you are yourself, unaware of things, you care for yourself, your identity is identified by yourself, right? And if
yeah,
you have a family, you extend that identity to your family, right? You start caring about your family. And if you have a community where you've grown up, you extend that identity of yours to consume the identity of your community as well, and you try to work better for that community, and you keep expanding that, and you expand it to a nation. And that's how you have an identity, your identity so entwined with a nation that you are willing to die for that country, right?
yeah,
And that has to be genuine. That doesn't have to be like you just, because it's very un-British at times, as far as I know, of people just waving flags, right? It's something so implicit that you don't have to do it. You don't have to show you're
yeah,
patriotic by just your existence, right? But your love for your deep country comes from your heart, right? And of course, like there will be people who match with the country, from the get-go, or like even if they're first generation, like myself, right? I'm first generation in this country. But for that to happen as well, you have to actually give up your tribe. You have to reject your tribe to
mm,
be able to accept a new tribe so fully, right? So fully, and be prepared to do everything you can for it. You have to actually reject it. So if I was here, right, and I had on my profile, I had the, well, I would have three flags then, right? Because I was born and raised in Kuwait, and then I lived for 10 years in Pakistan. So, and then I'm been here for 14 years, and I'm married to a Polish woman. So if I had four flags on my profile, right, the four cultures that I'm
mm,
mixed with, who will I fight for
right,
when it's the time of need, right? So
mm,
I have to actively reject, I have to actively discriminate against every other tribe to be part of one tribe. Otherwise, I'm not fully part of any tribe, right?
yeah,
And that's fair enough as well. Like some people have a curse of being nomadic. Some of that curse is upon me as well. I haven't been able to be of one place for a very long time, but then be honest about it as well, right?
mm,
Don't pretend to be like, oh, I'm of that country and I want to represent of that country.
yeah,
But my main issue with Cami was like, she is not going to win the elections,
right,
right? So it's sort of like, okay, if I'm in favor of destroying the Tory party, then go for Kemi Badenoch. Yeah, good for you, destroy the party.
Mm,
But if I understand the fact that if we want to bring change in this country and conservative change in this country, then we need a party which is mo- really infiltrated into the whole of the country, right? It has all the apparatus that you need at local level and at the national level, right? Reform Party is not at that stage, and it doesn't feel like Reform Party leadership understands the importance of local democracy, because they are not working at that level still. They're just stealing conservative local councillors, but not actually building their own, like, offices and stuff like that in local areas and actually doing some work. Still not doing it. I don't know if they have future plans or not. So it's easy to bring the change that you need from all levels if you were to take over a Tory party instead, right? If an actual conservatives took over the Tory party. And the rhetoric, even though Jenrick might not be a full conservative, but the rhetoric that at least he was putting forward enabled a lot of conservatives in the party and outside the party, enabled them to actually express their views
sure.
without being considered like something of a pariah, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That was my main thing against her. That, like, that, and combined with, I don't think so she's a competent leader. She doesn't connect with people.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, she's got a certain amount of managerial capability, which we saw perhaps in Rishi Sunak as well to an extent. But she doesn't have charisma, she doesn't have personality, she doesn't have charm. She's got a reputation as something
Hmm.
of a hardline kind of manager, which is not what you need right now. You need somebody with proper charisma, who's a people person, who's intelligent, capable, witty. And so I think she's the wrong person for this current moment. I also think that one of the issues when we're talking about a party apparatus is that that's one thing that's practical, of course. Whether it's Reform or the Tories, Reform are doing quite a lot at local level. It's just taking a slow time of it because I don't think they have a big team or the budget that they need.
Hmm.
But they are getting there, and they will have plenty of people stand for them in locals, and they'll do very well. And I'm sure by the next general election, they'll have a pretty good on the ground structure. So it can be done. The Tories aren't the only game in town on that front. They're certainly still the best, I think, at it. But that will not last for long, as long as Reform stays as an active party for a long period of time. But putting that to one side, what neither of them have is any kind of underpinning philosophy to their politics, to their policy, and to the way that
Yeah,
they
yeah.
select
Hmm.
politicians, right? And you have this division even within, I mean, the Reform Party is only 5 MPs, right? But even within that five caucus in Parliament, there's this huge disparity of opinions. So, I mean, Nigel, for instance, is openly against
Hmm.
the suicide bill, as I'm calling it. I'm refusing to call it the assisted dying bill because it is not. And then you also have Richard Tice saying that it's the best thing since sliced bread. And I mean, even on things like mass
Hmm.
deportation, you've got James McMurdoch who's in favour and you've got Nigel who's against. I mean, there's all of these fundamental differences to what they actually believe. Um, and so the same thing is true in the Tory party and always has been, but at least within the Tory party, because there are a lot more MPs, you expect that kind of division of consistency. But what will bring them together is going backwards. And I think this is something that Dr. David Starkey has said a lot recently, a man whose work I greatly admire.
Hmm.
Friend, I believe he is really onto something when he talks about how we need to look at the history of what it means to be conservative rather than just the economics or the party politics or in some ways even the philosophy. The philosophy is important, but also the history. We're not looking at our own history. There was a fundamental constitutional reform under Tony Blair
Hmm.
that consecutive Tory governments did nothing to try and reverse. I mean, they made certain attempts economically, but they made no attempts to tear down the Supreme Court. You've got Nigel Farage now saying that we should make the House of Lords an elected chamber. These are huge, vast, sweeping constitutional reforms that are doing away with the fundamental basis of what it means to be a British Parliament or a British democracy. We're doing away with the power that our monarch used to possess, which was then conferred on the House of Lords and by extension the Prime Minister in the lower chamber. we're not really looking at what it means to be conservative within the context of Britain. So, yes, this goes back very much to what we were talking about in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of local ideology, and all of these things. The further you move away from the root of what it means to be British, both politically, ideologically, and indeed culturally, the less you understand what the cure or the remedy is. And right now, we're kind of swimming against the tide, but we don't know how to steer. We don't know how to um, guide our boat in the right direction. And of course, the first thing to do is undo as much change as possible. If you want to be a proper conservative, you've got to ride roughshod over all the
Mm.
constitutional changes that have come in to enable us to get to this point in time, because institutional takeover, Marxist takeover in the universities, all of these things we talk about, that doesn't happen without massive constitutional change right at the very top. I mean, sometimes I disagree slightly with Dennis Prager and that famous quote of, politics is downstream from culture, because actually,
Mm.
culture is sometimes is downstream from politics. We forget that, and political change at such a grand scale, where you're doing away with the fundamental building blocks of our constitution, you're introducing a Supreme Court that can overturn Parliament even after it's received a stamp of authority from the King. That's quite a big change. And then if you think about the Human Rights Bill and all these other things that started to warp the way we saw diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all of these other nonsense terms that started to come in around 2000 onwards, to really get to the root of this and prevent Marxism in the educational institutions, or whatever it is that your pet peeve is, you have to undo the political change that happened first. And I just don't see Reform or the Tory party in its current iteration, or any Conservative party that exists in this country, being capable of understanding that problem, or analysing it properly, or finding the solution without a lot of thought, and the right people who are willing to stick their necks out over this.
I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a clear lack of vision, right? So they're all reactionary,
Mm,
including Reform Party, and they're very good at being reactionary. That's why you're seeing, like, even Rishi Sunak, before the leadership change, he was a lot better as an opposition leader than he was as a leader of the House, right? And that's because when you're in the opposition, all you have to do is react to whatever the government is doing,
mm,
and you can come up with whatever witty remarks and stuff that you want, and look makes you look good, and seems like, oh, you're fighting something because something is happening to you, because you don't have a vision. You're not going to start a fight, you're not going to lead properly. And
yeah.
that's what I see with all of them. And with Reform Party, like, you know I'll give this analogy, right? So what I see Reform Party as is, imagine, like, there's people on the bus, right? There's a lot of people on the bus, and they're all on the same team, right? But they don't actually know where they're going, right? They're on the bus, they're all on the bus, they're all prepared for it. But some of the people on the bus are prepared, like, are dressed up to go to the beach. Other people on the bus are dressed up to go for a hike. The other people are dressed up to go to a party and stuff like that. So they're going together, but they don't really know what the destination is, because they haven't defined that. They're not unified for it, right? And I don't know why that is. And obviously, I know, no, sorry, I do know why that is. It's because they don't have a vision,
Mm,
because they're not themselves what they are most of the time claiming to be as well. And it's the same crowd as well. It's similar feeling of the crowd that I find on the streets sometimes, who shout Christ is King, Christ is King,
mm.
who do that but have never gone to church themselves, or never do go to church themselves, never read Bible themselves, and don't understand the wisdom of the Christ, right? They just want, it's just a reaction,
Mm,
right? A reaction is not enough to bring the appropriate change. What's going to happen is that your reaction is going to fizzle down at some point, because nobody can keep up with having that reaction and stuff.
mm,
People, that's why people are becoming more and more indifferent, and we're seeing less and less people turning up to vote as well. That's going to fizzle out, and people who have a vision, no matter how corrupt that is, which is on the left, they're going to win. right? Because they are going to overcome you. They're going to, they play the long game. They're going to tire you out, and then you're going to keep on accepting little bits of socialism here or there. Well, it's for the better anyways. Well, trans people are humans too. Why should we be mean to them? And little by little, little by little, it's just going to become the norm,
Mm,
right? And this is what I saw within COVID times as well. This is what scared me, of how, like, people don't have a vision. They'll only start reacting, and then they will just start parroting what someone else has said. They will become famous. Some of them have become famous through that time, right? They had no idea of their own, but during COVID time, they were in that red pill space. They started saying shit that, they didn't even know what it was.
mm.
But that's as far as they will go. They don't have a vision.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things to think about here. One is, why would we be reactionary when the left is so much further ahead of us at being reactionary? We can't perfect it. It's like, a boxer coming into MMA and trying to just be a grapple artist and trying to win by submission all the time. Well, you're a boxer, so you're going to have to try and punch. You've got to do the thing you're good at. You're not going to win against somebody who's so many years ahead of you in another sport. And we're in this other situation where we simply don't have leadership. And I think this is the best thing I can point to in reform, is that, of course, Nigel's come back in, and Nigel is this kind of super politician, this charismatic figure, but he doesn't really have a lot of experience in terms of leadership. And this is something that has to be pointed out, right? He hasn't been the leader of a political party that has seats in parliament. He hasn't been trying to win a general election before. And so you've got to really consider all of those parameters when you're talking
I
about the
think so.
leadership
You're stuck.
conversation. And of course, we saw something similar as well with Donald Trump as well, where the first time he won, he didn't necessarily know what he was doing. But this time round, he really does. And you've got to have that experience first before you get there. Um, and so this crisis of leadership paired with the wrong tactic, which is to be reactionary when actually we should be stable, pragmatic, and conservative, is creating the perfect storm where the left can keep winning even though they're not popular. Keir Starmer is not popular. His government is not popular. The
Hmm.
majority of the country did not vote for them. They do not want them in power, but they're in power because we keep on making mistakes. We cannot get our ship in order. And it's all very well wanting to tear apart the Tory party, but I've always been one of the strongest voices calling for reform in the Tory party. I believe it should be torn down to be raised back up again. But without the Tory party, there would be zero chance of having any kind of inhibition on what Labour wants to achieve in the next 4 years. It's just a numbers game, isn't it? So without proper analysis of the situation and without proper setting aside of ego and without proper leadership, we are just going to fall apart in the next 4 years. And unfortunately, as doomerish as that sounds, there isn't a really obvious concrete way out other than to hope that a very, very strong overarching cause brings everybody together. This is what happened with Brexit to an extent. It kind of put everyone's ego to one side because they all had a united purpose. And I think mass migration, immigration is doing a similar kind of thing now, but it's not hasty enough. It's not bringing people together fast enough. In America, it pretty much was Trump or bust. I mean, they couldn't have done anything else. They either voted in
Yeah.
Trump or they got World War III. So you need to get to that crisis point to make
Hmm.
humans
Hmm.
act properly. And we're not quite there yet.
Yeah. I mean, this is why I was so invested in the Tory leadership, right? Because I saw what Jendrik was saying. Doesn't matter if he had followed through or not. There was a way where you could unite the people, right? When if he won the Tory leadership and he was saying what Nigel Farage should have been saying, right, and saying it better at times as well, then you make it okay for everyone else to be able to say it. You make it okay not just in the in the political space, but in the public space, within offices, within your local governments, the staff, and everyone. Like, yeah, okay, a Tory leader is saying it, so that means it's okay for me to say it as well. Like, I can challenge that. If some manager wants to fire me for that reason, I can challenge that then, right? and that creates that culture when people are openly allowed to say it. Right now, if only Nigel Farage is saying, it's very easy to box him, right? Or even when Tommy Robinson says this, it's easy to box these people, not their fault, but the fault of how the landscape is. Oh yeah, but they are just racist, so put them on the side. It's very easy to do that. But
Yeah.
if a Tory leader did that, right, then this is why I was saying, like, don't choose Kemi, choose him. He's actually trying to be brave, trying to do something. Doesn't matter if he's done something in the past or not, just do that. And what showed me, when Nigel Farage started attacking Generic, that was a point where I was like, well, it seems like you're more invested in your personal gain in this regard, because you see him as a threat to Reform Party right now, rather than, not like, he could have chosen not to react and let it play out, right, rather
Right.
than
Well,
either go against him
I
or
think
for
that's
him.
the issue for reform is the hunter. Traditionally, Nigel is the hunter. He's seeking the big
Mm,
lion. He wants to take his pot shot and hopefully get the
mm,
kill. But he took his pot shot, and now the animal is wounded, and he's got to move in for the kill, and he doesn't know how, right? Because he's never actually got to this position
yeah,
before. So you're in a unique position where actually reform, even though they're in the insurgent party, they have a target on their back as well. They're fighting a wounded animal, and this wounded animal knows how to kill
mm,
up close and personal. And if Nigel wanted to perform the coup de grace and actually put the animal out of its misery and win, he would have to become like the animal. He would have to become properly conservative. He would have to be
yeah,
putting philosophy ahead of policy. He'd have to be thinking about, a 10, 20-year plan. And the interesting thing for me, when you look at Donald Trump won because he is, a complete maverick. He had never happened before. But he also only won because he was the Republican nominee. He was at the head of the beast,
yeah,
and he was guiding it. He was sitting on
mm,
top of the lion and riding it into battle, if you want to keep the analogy going. He wasn't just killing
yeah,
it and putting it out of its misery and trying to replace it. So we have a problem in this party, mainly because of our electoral system, where you can't just be an insurgent party and create something new unless you really have, for want of a better phrase, your shit together. Because without that, you can't
mm,
actually. You're going to be gate kept. You're going to not understand the halls of power. You're not going to understand Westminster. You're not going to understand what it means to keep a party going for 20, 30 years. And of course, in places like Italy and the Netherlands, we've seen these wonderful examples of small parties like Fratelli d'Italia, and the Farmers' Party in the Netherlands just burst onto the scene and win at locals and
mm,
take over, and everything's great. But that can't happen in this
mm,
country because of our constitution. And if you
yeah,
want to get rid of the constitution, which Nigel does, well, that's one solution. But then you open up a whole nother can of worms because you also destroy our tradition and the meaning of conservatism. So you have to work with the system in this country to an extent. That doesn't mean you have to be part of the system, but it means you have to play it smart. And part of playing it smart means you have to make very selective and proper alliances as you go. And Generic is an example. I mean, if Generic won, he wouldn't have been able to do anything with what he was saying because more than 60% of his MPs would have been against him anyway. But at least he would have been there as a voice, right? And then it would be about, for instance, trying
mm,
to make an alliance on immigration, or trying to have more voices heard together and making a pact behind the scenes where Reform and the Tories don't counter signal on that kind of thing. It doesn't have to be public, but there are ways of doing this that would allow you to keep going.
yeah,
And so for me as a strategist, it's sometimes frustrating to see that there's no one taking a step back. And I think one of the problems for this, which we can talk about more, is that we don't really have institutions in this country capable of doing that. So in the US, as an example, we've got the Heritage Foundation, and in Hungary, as another example, they have the MCC and the Danube Institute, which are these wonderful think tanks, institutions that support their governments and give them policy, give them staffing, give them the fundamental basis for what they believe. They sort of are the architects of what's going on there. And unfortunately, in this country, we don't have institutions like that. We've got sort of pale imitations of them in, the Legatum Institute and the Adam Smith Institute and the IEA,
mm,
but they don't really do anything other than propose things, occasionally get policy wins. They're not formulaic. They don't have let's say the Heritage Foundation, as an example, has, it produces Project 2025, or Project 2029 will be the next one, or Project 2030, or whatever they're working on next. And this then becomes the basis for the next Republican government's philosophy, their staffing, the suggestions for everything that needs to happen on day one of the presidency. We don't have anything concrete like this. And because we don't have that, because we don't have huge donors who are funding these projects, who make the politicians come to them for support, the politicians kind of get it in their heads that they're the stars of the show. And actually, they're not. What's normally the star of the show is the philosophy or the ideology that they represent. And that is normally guided by institutions rather than by politicians. So one of the solutions in this country is that we need a far stronger conservative institution than we've ever had before.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good point, because this is I was saying this like a long time ago as well, that we need an institution, we need to build that, right? I had this idea as well of like building an institution which I was calling the New Jerusalem Project, right? So to build Jerusalem back again in England, right? Because you don't just, and not just to supply the policies or the strategies to the politicians, but to also sort of upgrade your society as well along with it, right? The
Absolutely, the
water base
cultural,
itself.
artistic elements, the philosophy, all of this stuff is
Exactly,
really
and we
important.
see like we see little pockets of it trying to do it. We see like, New Culture Forum, and
Mm,
the guys that are doing with Lotus Eaters and stuff like that. They're trying to bring people together,
mm.
but you really need like on a bigger scale than that. You need
Yeah, I mean,
investors
the
and
other
stuff,
thing
and the
with
problem that we have
those
is we don't
projects,
have investors.
sorry, those I was going to say those projects are incredibly personal to certain sets of people as well. They're not all encompassing.
Yeah.
One of the problems we have is
Mm,
that, and this is adding to what you were just saying, the civil service really
mm,
used to take the place of those institutions. So when the politicians came and left every
yeah.
4 years, it didn't matter because the civil
Mm,
service would continue. And since the civil service became woke, it became politically captured, it wasn't doing its job anymore. We don't have any continuancy. So in other countries, for instance, in Russia, as an example, Putin has been leader for a long, long time. He doesn't need a civil service underneath him, right? So when
yeah.
he makes plans about grand strategy, he knows that it will be him fulfilling it in 5, 10 years' time. And that means we can't compete with these other superpowers just on a practical level. China is another example. They have grand strategy that lasts 200, 250 years. They have this end goal they're always
Yeah.
chasing. And we become very short termist in what we're doing.
I wouldn't say civil service is not doing its job. I would say civil service is not doing the job for the British people, right? His job has been changed. So
Sure.
he's doing a job. That job is not for the betterment of this country. That job is for, whatever ideology that has been captured with. It's
Mm.
not just them, it's the local government and everyone in the public institution. And this is the problem that people don't understand, because they don't pay attention. The voter turnout for local elections is always very low. People don't understand where the politics actually happens at that level. Everything that is affected in this country is affected by the local governments and stuff.
Yeah.
And what's happening over there, people need to start paying some attention to it. That's why the local councillors are actually a lot more important than MPs, even, because they are the ones who are feeding into the MPs most of the time as well. And if they
Mm.
are woke, then you know and that's the case in a lot of conservative councils as well, because they have councillors who are asleep at the helm. They have
Yeah.
no idea what the local authorities are doing themselves.
So
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about over there, but I know we're short on time. I think so we should talk about these things at some other point as well. So yeah, I mean, quickly, we can quickly talk about what do you think is going to happen in 2029? It's still far away, right? And there's
yeah.
a lot of things to play out. But what do you see?
Well, I see one of two things happening. Either there will be a one of three things really, because there are two options within what could happen on our side. But the first scenario is that things continue as they are. There are some changes made. Reform does better. The Tories once again probably have another change of leader and continue along as they are right now. And we get to the point where Labour are doing so badly that actually Reform and the Tories gain enough seats to get into Parliament together and a hung Parliament rather, and to form a government under coalition. That's one example. The second example would be that Reform don't do as well. The Tories stay on their course, and actually Labour do well enough in the final few years that they scrape by with a hung parliament in which they get a coalition with the Lib Dems. And then I think your third option is that either one of Reform or the Tories really get their act together, take over the other party entirely, and go on to win. So those are your three possible solutions, I think. I can't see Labour winning outright again in 2029. It's possible,
Mm.
but I just think that they're going to perform so badly in the next 4 years that they'll essentially be the Democrats of 2029. As long as there's someone vaguely charismatic up against them, they're not going to do too well, particularly in the traditional Labour heartlands. So I don't think we have to worry too much about, a socialist government for 10 years. But there is another option where people decide to put their egos first and, both Reform and the Tories fall into disarray, split each other's votes so much that actually Labour gets in again. That's a very distant possibility. I don't really think that's going to happen to the extent that Labour needs it to happen. I look at how badly Keir Starmer's doing, and I can't see him lasting another term. And the only thing that could throw in, a spanner into the works would be if Labour got rid of Starmer and elected somebody very young, very charismatic, and very intelligent. And that would have to be almost a Tony Blair light. And I don't really see the talent in their ranks to do that currently.
They have
So,
very few options for that, anyways.
yeah, exactly. So, I mean, really, there's only three options. Maybe a fourth if Labour do really well, and get somebody young and charismatic in. But I don't think people need to be too pessimistic about the Labour government. I think it's only going to last 4 years. I can't see it lasting longer than that. And I hope that what happens in the meantime is leadership on the right gets its act together, starts to examine what it really means to be conservative rather than just pandering to populist policies, and begins to awaken in the same way that America has. Because don't forget, I mean, for all you want to argue whether or not Joe Biden managed to steal the last election, regardless of that, he did pretty well. Um, and he didn't this time, or the Democrat Party didn't this time, and that's because they saw through the facade. Even if you take away the
Mm.
mysterious 20 million voters that disappeared, there was still quite a big shift of several million voters anyway. And we've got to hope the same thing happens here. But our problem, as ever, is unity. And the only way to solve that unity is to have an underlying
Mm.
philosophy that guides what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think that 2029 is not where that's going to happen, where the unity is going to happen. I
Mm,
think so that's going to happen in 2034, because certain people, certain egos need to be either get too old or just become disinterested and get out of the way so that actual conservatives can come through, right?
yeah,
um I have a feeling that in 2029 the voter turnout is going, like, the parties are actually going to be fighting only 20% or 25% of the voters
yeah,
anyways,
yeah,
right? So the margin is going to be very small. So and the conservative voters again are not going to turn out, because most what happened in 2024 as well is that the conservative voters didn't come out. If they came out more, Labour won't have a chance.
absolutely.
I have a feeling that would happen. I'm pessimistic about 2029, but I'm also think a lot of it, a lot of what's going to happen in 2029 depends on who takes advantage of this farmers movement right now, which party takes the advantage most.
I totally
And what
agree.
I see is like a party, I think so, like a party that is actually sneakily taking advantage of that is Liberal Democrats,
Hmm.
because they just don't have strong ideas, so they can go with anyone, and this is the reason why they won so many seats and they will win again,
Mm.
because they just ran a non-political campaign.
That's,
And
that's
that's how
that's
they
kind of
won it,
why I
right?
see the
It was a
three
masterstroke for me.
options there, because you know, if Labour are to win next time, they'll have to do it with the help of
Hmm.
the Lib Dems, in my opinion. I don't see them winning outright, but I
Mhm.
do see the possibility of a Lib Dem
No,
Labour
yeah,
coalition for sure. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, let's see what happens. And Yeah, hopefully you can come again and we can talk further about these things.
Absolutely, yeah. Have fun.
Thank you so much for coming on. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you everyone for watching, and I'll catch you next time.